Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, I do want to clarify who I am to a lot of people that have recently been coming to our channel. And I have been in this field for over 50 years, studying all areas of manifesting science, which includes all the mystical sciences and all the alternative sciences. I've written over 35 books, 5 courses. I've been on the BBC, CNN, numerous radio shows, published hundreds of articles, and been running the IGOS Success Tech since 1980. And we have many, many firsts, and of course, we're specialists in subtle energy instruments, oftentimes called radionics, as well as many other tools that are exclusive to my engineering understanding, which I have produced on the website and which are extremely rare and powerful. Now let's talk about ancient cultures. Now, as usual, we are caught in a web of deception and urban legends. The bottom line is that we somehow continually are being pushed to the crotch of the world, meaning the Middle East. And I don't believe hardly anything has come out of the Middle East of any value. And we can just look at the history and of that particular area. It's caught up in all these what it can considered very psychotic religions that have produced nothing but violence, whether that's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. These are really mentally ill thought forms that have produced absolutely nothing after 4,000 years of Judaism, 2,000 years of Christianity, and 1,500 years of Islam has achieved nothing. And it certainly doesn't seem to be doing anything for the people there. As, unfortunately, all these kind of thought forms that don't seem to help anybody. Certainly India is not the bastion of wonderfulness, nor is China with all of its belief systems and Zen and everything else of Asia in general, if we want to name bigger areas. And unfortunately, there really isn't anything that involves human species that is really evolved. But getting caught into the fact that only Egypt was this great society is kind of ignorant. While there were societies in that area that reached a certain level of sophistication, but of course, you know, the Egyptians were all incestuous. All they did was worry about death. I'm not sure how evolved they were. As a culture, they have seemed to produce most everything. It seems like from beer making to grinding of wheat, it seems like the Egyptians were the ones that got involved in that, and or started it, or invented it, whatever you want to call it. They also were off in many, many areas and thought the brain was totally useless. While the brain may be overestimated in modern society, it certainly isn't useless that you just pull it out and throw it away. So a little bit too much emphasis, a lot of emphasis given to the Egyptians is overrated. Their superstitions, their religions, and everything else were not all that evolved. We look at their outside society and say, gee, they built all these great monuments, and which were mostly temples and mostly things that glorified the pharaohs. I'm not sure what else was there. Doesn't seem to be all that much of achievement in terms of things. They certainly had some great science to a degree, but to what extent? And libraries and everything else. Did they really have that? A lot of that came a little bit later. We also have to understand that they got all their information from the great societies. The teachers that came to them were from Atlantis, Mu, and other places, and they passed that tradition on. Then, of course, the Greeks who occupied Egypt for many hundreds of years, I think it's 700 years, occupied Egypt, took all their information and synthesized it through their Greek mind. And, of course, the Greeks, ancient Greeks had a great grasp of many things, and they built great monuments as well. This was then passed on to the Romans, who for 600 years ruled most of the world and has been the greatest empire known to date. So this is what has connected us to the Middle East because of the fact that Rome and, of course, Greece, Athens is very close to the Middle East. So you've picked up all those kind of belief systems. But you do have to remember that none of that caught on all that much. Christianity, like most religions, was converted by the sword point, particularly throughout all of Europe. People didn't just become Christians because it was nice. So Christianity did tend to catch on a little more because it did a lot of healing, and it was kind of a kinder, gentler religion when it started. But far from taking over, and far from what we understand it as of today. As a matter of fact, there's a book that's been going around for a while of an ancient Egyptian practices, rituals, whatever you want to call it, and it involved human sacrifice. So the whole idea is all of this is very overblown, of this Christianity that we think is so wonderful and pure. And it was invented by the Romans to subdue some very violent pagan type groups and feed them with, be nice, turn the other cheek, etc. So it's quite a fabrication when you get into the whole reality of it. So we need to keep that in mind. But the point is, everybody was centered there. And of course, the Romans, to control everybody, instead of keeping their own Mithraism, they renamed Mithra, Jesus, and so forth, and took a lot of the belief systems, what happened there, and turned it into their form of Roman Catholicism or Christianity, which is a unique form different than the hundreds of other Christianities, and very pagan based with all the saints and everybody else. So it fitted in with their reality, and the problem is it also took a lot of their philosophies, which weren't great. But so we look at that, and everybody thinks that this is the where civilization came from, and it's just not true. And since the predominant culture would be European cultures, everybody has thought that, well, why did everything come from there and so forth? Well, that's why everything came from there. But it surely was not solely a Middle Eastern thought form. It blended with these very powerful, very intelligent cultures of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and developed in what it is today, going through that. But that's an awful long time ago. People think that, well, it was Rome, and after Romans it was the Middle Ages, and it was as simple as that. So it was medieval times. Well, it's not true. The Romans were hundreds of years before that, and there were great advances made by the Romans, which were forgotten and not used for the next 1,000 years, and even continues to this day. While Roman aqueducts and roads are used to this day through most of Europe in one way or another, and their technologies right down to cobblestone streets, one of the most horrific inventions you can think of, but were effective. These technologies were used, but it never really went anywhere because of, unfortunately, a very primitive state of the European mind, and of course the mind of the world. You also had a major influx of Middle Eastern, particularly Islamic invaders that invaded all of North Africa, took all the countries by force. Algeria's, Tunisia, all these countries, Egypt, were all eventually invaded by Islam, who then pushed its way up for hundreds of years, and I believe it's 800 years. They occupied Spain and so many other areas of that place of Europe, even pushing into northern Italy and several other places in Europe, and occupied it until Queen Elizabeth of Spain pushed them out. But they had already made this Middle Eastern impact on that entire area of Spain. So this caused racial problems. That's why the Spanish have this kind of gray look to them, or I should say brownish look. While we think Latins or Spanish were actually, well, they're not. They were actually white, very much similar to their neighbors and so forth, with blue eyes, etc. Now we have that combination, which we have people that look Hispanic. So that's where all that comes from. It comes from the Arabs. So you got to remember that's the influence, and that's why we have that. Now, these cultures, including all Middle Eastern cultures, including the Jews, etc., were very aggressive countries. People, I should say, that kept documents and were trying to take over the world wherever they could. And if it wasn't for the Muslims fighting each other with their two different sects, they probably would have taken over the world. The Muslims tried to take Vienna twice. The Mongols came in and conquered a large part of the Middle East, but were eventually pushed out by some Muslim armies. And of course, they've been pushing around the world ever since. And this actually continues to this day in other ways. So we need to understand that this is how you could call it almost Eurocentric people look at things. So they look at these very foreign religions, and God now comes from the Middle East for the Europeans, for the Romans who made up this religion that became so part of them, basically the Roman Italians, and then everybody else who's converted over to Christianity by the sword. So where does all that stem from? Well, everybody got traced back to, well, this is where they came from. And there's all sorts of rationalizations that they were actually from the tribe of Adam, which of course was the white tribe. All these things happen of this very confused thought form. And to have a religion spread around the world, and of course it's almost different in every country. And then of course there's major, I don't know how many hundreds of types of Christian religions there are that are trying to use the same combination book, the old Jewish book with the new Christian book. All this together, of course, causes mass confusion and has, like all religions, has done nothing for mankind. And as I've mentioned, we have thousands of years, 4,000 years of Judaism, 4,000 years of Buddhism, done absolutely nothing. Certainly Hinduism has done nothing, Zen has done nothing, Taoism, whatever it is, which is followed by very few people from what I understand, has done absolutely nothing. So where did all the great societies really come from? Well, first of all, there seems to have been this indigenous population that's around the world, and they look all very similar. If you put an American Indian next to a Mayan, they look very similar. And even to a certain extent, Aboriginals in Australia, there's a certain look to them. Even Asian, Chinese, etc. If you take the Chinese, more of the older pictures of people who are kind of grown up in the more in the country, they look almost identical. So there's a certain look. And now these are the indigenous people that spread all over the actual world. The so-called white people, which are basically the Celtics, the Greeks, the Romans, the Welsh, the Basque, other people who are very unique kind of culture that we're really not sure where they came from in terms of, it certainly doesn't make sense that they migrated from northern India and other places. Just doesn't add up. So what happens is that when they had the fall of Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, whatever you want to call it, and this was outlined by James Churchward, W-A-R-D, Churchward, James Churchward. Now he wrote some very interesting books on Mu and everything else and has a lot of documentation there and should be taken very seriously. Because the most of the advancements and the more intelligent people that were in these societies fled to different areas at the fall. And I believe there were different races there. We're unsure of where they came from. So a certain group of these went into the actual European areas, which we call white people. Other ones didn't, and they're kind of mixed races, and they apparently originated in the Middle East, like the Germans who are Iranians. That's what Aryan means. And there's these different places in Europe. Northern Europe has what are considered Nordics. These are the more white types that went into Northern Europe. And they have very distinctive looks to them if you look at the racial combination of these different groups generally. So, if you look at an ancient Greek, such as Alexander the Great, he looks like a typical Nordic. So do many of the Roman emperors. And at different times, they've looked different because you got to remember that Italy is right next to the Middle East, and the Italians have been heavily involved in the Middle East and in Africa for years. So there's a great binding, and of course now we have the flood of people coming from all these other countries. So the major influence in Greeks, which is now which has been taken over by Islam anyway in terms of the cultures, and of course most of Italy. So you have a totally different group there, but that's not the original group of people. But this is all, of course, the movement of people. Where's the greatest culture? Well, the greatest cultures all started in North America and went through Central and South America. The problem is these cultures predate all the other cultures by thousands of years. Now, there does seem to have been a direct contact with Egypt and the what you'd call the Mayan Aztec type cultures, whatever the people were at that time when the Egypt was at flourishing. I'm not sure what dynasty or not, but they have found cocaine in the different burial places in Egypt, which means the only place that cocaine comes from is these Central and South American places, mostly Central America. Now, the real story seems to be that there was a great civilization in North America where it started. And of course, North America has quite a nice place to live with lots of water. Climate in a lot of areas is pretty good, lots of game, and natural resources. But for one reason or another, these people, or the majority of them, left to go to better places, I guess warmer, more jungled places such as Mexico, South America, etc. And you're talking pretty lush areas in these places from what I understand. Much better than the plains of North America and the hot places of Texas, California, and other places, particularly in the southwest of the United States. It appears that the Aztecs and others actually originated from what would be considered Utah area of the United States now. That's what they state in their history. Why should we contradict that? So they originated there and they decided to go down into Mexico, and then from there they spread. This, of course, makes sense. There has been some major finds of huge structures that were in North America. And, of course, these are in pretty bad conditions. They've only kind of found basic structure footings, foundations of these things. But it can be shown that there were some huge cities in North America at that particular time. And these, of course, have now, as I said, are down to such small amounts of rubble and would take so much money to do this that you can, will never be done. But there's a lot of information already been produced there, and quite a few books on the mound builders of North America, etc. Now, a lot of people have come to North America as well. It was known through all of particularly Northern Europe and parts of France that Vineland was there. It's been thought of that actual Irish have come to North America. There's been proof that the Chinese were on the West Coast. And there's even talk about Jewish tribes and other things that may have made it to North America. Now, this is not too strange. Why wouldn't that happen? The world is not what people think it is. You look at a globe and you see all the water. But if you look at the actual land structures, you can follow a coast of a land structure, like from Alaska. You can go all the way down to the tip of South America by just following the land. And that's what people did, because you had to come in for water and other things. So that's what they did, and you could do that. So it shows you how far you can go by just following land instead of having to, quote, navigate. This can also be extrapolated to go in the other direction. So once you cross certain areas, going from Alaska down into, but you can go through Europe and other places. So, I mean, all of this is a lot smaller than you think. Now, so there was this culture, and it was been proven by Thor Heyerdahl that he was able to sail a Egyptian reed boat made out of reeds, which, amazing how strong these type of ships are. I actually saw this movie as a teenager in a drive-in, and it was very fascinating. Always left an interesting impression on me on how he was able to do this. Thor Heyerdahl also proved that you could sail a raft from Peru to Polynesia. And so it just shows you how there was these cultures out there that were doing this, and it was very, very possible and most likely was done. So we do know for certain that cocaine was found in Egypt, so where did that come from? Now, we also understand that I'm not sure that the cultures are that similar. I mean, they certainly were builders and certainly were magnificent stone builders, both of them. But the actual cultures in Central and South America were much bigger than Egyptian ever was. They're 10 times bigger monuments and streets, and apparently they're almost everywhere from Mexico down to God knows where, that the jungles had giant cities there. Almost anywhere you go in some of these jungled areas, you're going to run into a city. Now, the whole idea is the jungle has taken back these cities, so they're not seen like they are in Egypt. So everything in Egypt is a matter of digging, and while it's a momentous and difficult job, it's not the same as going into a jungle and having to dig there. Not only that, there's some very dangerous situations in jungles because they're loaded with all sorts of dangerous animals and insects that may have been deliberately put there to keep these places from being explored. Think about that. There's also huge amounts of extraterrestrial sightings in Peru and other places, and still continue. These are areas that are pretty isolated, they're not overly tracked well, so if you want to go anywhere, well, this would be a place. It also seems to be a place where a lot of contact was made. The great empires tended to fall into horrible, decadent savagism with their massive amounts of human sacrifices, mostly because of the fact that they were overpopulated. So, human sacrifices became a great way to control the population, and it was an honor to be sacrificed. And of course, they used to sacrifice a lot of prisoners, and they did have endless civil wars, which is very typical with a lot of these. All of mankind, all they do is fight each other. We live in a warrior, psychotic society. We need to know that. So the whole idea is that the societies built in Mexico, Central America, and all these places were much more magnificent, and we must assume they were also much more advanced than Egypt. Now, why don't we know more? Well, that's because of what happened with the invading Europeans, this hybrid Spanish-Muslim culture that was brought to them. Well, first of all, nothing was really learned from there. All that happened there is they wanted the gold. So they didn't really spend any time to figure out what was going on. And even to this day, very little is known about the actual practices in ancient culture. Shamanism in these areas is like shamanism everywhere else. It's very crude and primitive, and we know nothing about any more of their sophisticated practices that must have been going on there. Now, shamanism in Peru and other places is very much based in the same old nonsense, using, llama fetuses and very primitive stuff. It's heavy energy, light energy. So it's very, very base shamanism, and very little is even known from there because there's very few real shamans left. But there are still lots and lots of actual sightings of UFOs and actual beings that appear in these areas. This started to become known with Shirley MacLaine in her books, who talked about going there and seeing and even meeting a lot of these extraterrestrials. This has never stopped, and of course this is a great place to do it. It's one of the few places on Earth still where it's kind of very primitive, and they don't have the kind of sophisticated military to deal with it. They also don't have the sophisticated public. The Latins throughout everywhere are very superstitious and steeped in old religions, and not in a good way generally. So they accept a lot of this stuff, and they have a very magical way of thinking, while the Catholic Church may have forced them to convert under the sword. These things are, most Latins will go to church on Sunday, and after that they'll go to their brujo, their shaman, after church. I mean, this is a cultural fact. But what's happened is they're becoming totally ignored because of the butchering that went there. Once the Spanish went in there, the Muslim Spanish went in there and butchered them and horribly tortured and murdered God knows how many tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, burnt everything they could. And this is typical. This happened throughout Europe as well. One of the major objectives of the Inquisition was not just to grab, quote, witches and people that didn't conform to their belief of Christianity, but every single monastery had books. And these books were unceremoniously, I should say, or maybe ceremoniously, grabbed and burnt. We need to understand that. So they got rid of any kind of literature that could be passed on. Well, this is something that happened, of course, then. There were numerous, maybe millions of books and carvings into wood that were burned. So, very few. From what I understand, there's only one or two that actually have survived. The rest of it, we're trying to figure out what was carved into rocks, and unfortunately, we don't have the Rosetta Stone like we found in the late 1800s in Egypt that helped us translate the hieroglyphics in Egypt. If we didn't have that, we still wouldn't know what they really meant. There was a guessing game that went on for almost 100 years where people took their entire life to try and figure out the hieroglyphics. Now, we have the same problem in the cultures from the Aztecs, Mayans, etc., and there's many cultures. We have no idea what they really, and we don't have the luxury of a translator. So, like the millions and millions of documents we have, even that have been saved and not burned, we have no idea what they mean. We haven't translated any of the languages, and we don't even have a clue. This is very true there. Now, James Churchward goes into all this and talks about this, shows a lot of the different carvings and other things. And this is where the cradle of civilization really came from. It's also interesting that there appears to be some sort of Chinese connection to these cultures, as well as a black African culture. There are carving giant heads of negroids, negroid features, in these different cities. There also seems to be a combination of some sort of Asian influence. Well, isn't this interesting? That these cities that flourished the way they did and were so much grander than Egypt had this influence of what considers to be Asians. And they have found an Asian group, I believe, again, was it Peru or Colombia or somewhere? They found that they traced them back to Japan. Now, if you take a boat and you sail it in the ocean straight from Japan, you will hit the coast, I believe, of Colombia or whatever. Again, don't hold me to the details. We're talking about generalities here. But they have found that they actually have Japanese DNA. So, of course, Thor Heyerdahl already proved that you could go into the Pacific from South America and Central America already with Kon-Tiki on the raft that I mentioned. So certainly all this makes sense, but it's rare to see a Negroid or African type structure anywhere in the world that did anything. But this may be the lost key to African empowerments, which seem to have been missed, that there is no great civilizations in Africa attributed directly to Negroids. But I find that hard to believe. Why isn't there? So the whole idea is here is a real clue, not something made up like the fact that Egyptians were Africans. Well, yeah, they're on the African continent, but they are Mediterranean Caucasians. So the whole idea, or you could call them Arabs or whatever. They certainly, as a general rule, were not Negro. So why are there giant heads of Africans in some of these areas? Why are there things that seem to be directly connected to Asia? Well, it's very interesting. And they built these giant, giant cities. So without spending hours talking about this, and I certainly could, what happened? Well, the problem is once these societies were destroyed, mostly, by the way, by disease. It wasn't 150 of these Spanish influenced Muslims that came in there and killed everybody. It was the fact that the society itself was kind of teed off. They were upset about the ruling people in government. Well, who isn't? And I'm sure that the same thing happened there that happened everywhere. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. So they weren't too happy, so there was a lot of infights. And of course, this is a human story. What happens? Why were the American Indians conquered as easily as they were? Because they were killing each other all the time. They didn't group together. So this is it. So what happened is that they were easily able to buy off the tribes that were there, and these people worked with this small group of people to then fight. And of course, it's very difficult of any trained army with guns not to beat everybody else. So they were, again, the typical European heroism where they shoot a bunch of natives that have spears and shields with guns. So, of course, that's part of it, but it still doesn't make sense because they were so highly organized. They were supported. But what happened, and it didn't happen necessarily as quick as people thought it happened, is the same thing that seems to change the entire world. It was ravished by disease. The diseases that the Europeans brought in, which apparently the natives were very susceptible to. And this is an old story, from what I understand. This happened up in North America as well. And one of the reasons why the British and Pilgrims were able to colonize so easily is because the natives were already ravaged by disease from the predecessors that were there, which were the Spanish, who you must remember colonized or at least landed and had major comings and going in Florida and so forth. They didn't stay in Florida. You're going to keep going up the coast. So these diseases that were brought there and devastated the population. Apparently this happened. But what happened with that is you brought the priesthood in, and they murdered people by the tens of thousands and burnt and burnt and burnt. All their culture was destroyed, which is common. And what's interesting is that the Aztecs destroyed the culture of the Mayans that they took over from, or however that is. Again, I'm not sure which one was that. But from what I understand, every culture, including when they took over from the Mayans, they killed all the Mayans and burnt all their stuff. So this is just what everybody does. So you can blame European stupidity, or you can blame human stupidity. There isn't any good humans. They're all intrinsically evil. So there is a lot of that going on right now and continues to go on. And what is in these jungles hidden under this, centuries and centuries of dirt? And there is a new city that has been found in Honduras, which they call the White City. And what's very interesting is that there seems to be they claim that this city was built by extraterrestrials. And one of the problems is it's highly it's in an area that's virtually impossible to get to. You have to fly helicopters in. Not only that, there's all sorts of bugs that bite you that you then burn your skin off. That goes into you. And these kind of horrific insects, which I believe is a way that planet Earth is taking back their environment, is by the fact that you can't go in these areas. And so there are horrible snakes that'll kill you. So there's all sorts of terrible, terrible larger animals. But what's even worse are these insects which can affect you that are so small and nearly impossible to control. So as we do all these types of things, we have to be fully understood of what exactly is going on. And that is these massive cities throughout this entire area. So there's another massive city. It was supposed to be huge. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people were living in a lot of these areas. And through overpopulation or some other thing, we just don't know, these cities have disappeared. But you can't grow indefinitely. There's going to be food shortages, water shortages, etc. And these seem to have been all causes. We just don't know what happened to so many of these societies. But when you get that big, there's a real problem. And, of course, that doesn't seem to be based in any kind of logical priesthood thinking. We've gotten to too much mysticism. Now, again, this new city found is contributed to an extraterrestrial who came there in a ship. Very interesting information. It also appears that Quetzalcoatl and other things, the serpent with feathers, well, this could have been and looks very much like what we consider a reptilian alien. So the reptilian aliens, which are kind of a low-level hostile group of people, could have taken over these societies. push them into this barbaric practices they had because maybe they enjoy feeding off of blood. Maybe they like the energy from death. But the cult of executing people and ripping their hearts out that we've all heard about the Aztecs doing is real. And they found supposedly tens of thousands of skulls piled in different places. So how much of the population that affected, what's the whole story there? Well, it's very hard to tell because it's all based in personal interpretation by some author that went there that probably doesn't know bupkis. So what are we to make of all that? Well, there does seem to be this reason of why these societies went into decay, and it does seem to be that they were involved with some very nasty god forms. And if you look into the gods of all of these people, they were all very nasty, destructive god forms that certainly were not pleasant to hang around with. I studied these recently, and if this information is correct, this is a very violent and disturbed group of people who got into great decadence because they weren't too concerned about actually surviving because they had plenty of water and can grow things, apparently. All of this is part of the survival of these people, but it's a very bad history. I would say worse than most. But there's so many stages and so little that we know, it's very hard to say. But there were massive cities there that dwarfed anything that the actual Egyptians ever made. Now, and there has been some very intricate building that went on. Not quite like the Egyptians. They made step pyramids. And step pyramids are pretty easy to build. It's not very complicated. When you have to make those kind of actual smooth sides that create a more a pyramid like you see in Egypt, well, that takes another level of actual engineering. But there's all sorts of things underneath these pyramids and things that haven't been released, and so many things that go on that we really don't know. But here we go. It's a society that has lasted a long period of time, has all these integrated things, other cultures, possible hostile extraterrestrials who took over their cultures and kind of imploded them. Then what came after that is once the Spanish were able to get a foothold there and control certain tribes, well, they easily conquered pretty much the rest of these peoples of the entire area and were able to take over and, of course, insert their religion, which is nothing more than a way of watching people. When you have churches everywhere, you have what's basically a monitoring station, almost a police-type station, where you can watch and monitor people. And, of course, that's how all those things were based on. So this is all very interesting to understand, and understand that the greatest societies, and everybody should read James Churchward's books on Mu, and go through his understanding. I think he lays out things very, very well. And certainly, while Egypt is, again, a focal point for many societies, one after another, for thousands of years, the Greeks, then the Romans, then, of course, even modern Europeans, and easy to get at because you don't have to fly in to go with places, while some of these things may be more isolated than others. Well, you basically just have to get a shovel and dig it up. You can't do that in jungles where you have deadly insects and other creatures and even problematic weather changes, particularly over this new city they found. It's quite mind-boggling when you see this whole new city and how it's kind of a strange, magical, and even controlled place. We have to really wonder what is there. Even weather changes are there, but you can't live there. You hardly have trouble researching there. All of this is part of what's going on with this new city, and certainly it's one of the best kind of protections you possibly have. But like a lot of the world that people tend to disregard, there are some extremely isolated places, and they'll never be public. Who's going to spend the money to build roads and open up places like this? It costs billions. The only time this happens is if you get a large corporation to come in there that wants to exploit an area, cut all the trees, dig for oil. They'll spend the billions to go in there and do that, but nobody else has that money. And generally when they do that, they disregard any kind of national or historical situations. They just want to grab what they can and get out as cheap as possible. So this world is very mysterious, and there's many places, particularly in that area of the world. And this was in Honduras, or was it Guatemala? Honduras, Guatemala area, where this new city was found. But I can tell you there's probably thousands of similar sites, and you can't get to it. It's dangerous, and this is the same old story. So they keep finding cities after cities all over these kind of areas, and who's going to go in there and spend millions of dollars to go in there and excavate these things, or even cut all the foliage back and everything? The stuff, when you see pictures of temples and other things that people have found, somebody's went in there and cut all that away. They've had to remove the jungle from there, which takes over. And who's doing that, and to what extent? So it's a very exciting area. Whatever all this means, I'm more for consciousness. I'm not really care what other cultures did. I'm presenting this because of the problematic situation with the disinformation urban legend that you're living in. People get ego, or they get, I don't know if it's egocentric, they get centered on this type of people from this area. And those people like to push that. Because these are places of how great these ancient Islamic communities were. Well, I don't know how Islamic they were, because a lot of them Islam is only 1,500 years old. So Samaria and all these other places go back to very ancient religions, as does Egypt. Mostly what they went in there and did in their massive seizing of huge parts of the Middle East and Europe was to go in there and steal everything, like most cultures do. They took all their information that they got from Egypt and Greece and other places, and then took this and used it for themselves to build certain things and to advance in mathematics and other things. For their very short period of time, they did that. But getting set in there, because that's where all the religions are. Of course, the Jews are there, and they're so great. And, of course, all the other people are so great, and the Egyptians are great, and everything else. And, of course, the Romans and Greeks are kind of even ignored in this day and age of how great they were. But it's not, we are, again, being Eurocentric here. The fact is that's where we think everything came from, when it really didn't. The mysteries and the empowerments of this world are still hidden, and hidden well. And they're in South, Central, and in Mexico. Until next time.